Okay, so this morning we're going to continue on Chav Ches Amud Aleph. Chav Ches Amud Aleph. We're in the first of the several of the wider lines right before the Mishnah. Just to refresh our recollection, the Gemara at this point is saying you could Simonim D'Oraisa. Remember, we're talking about Simonim. Are they D'Oraisa, D'Rabbanan? We learn the pasuk. So we say Simonim D'Oraisa. So the question is, what happens if there's two sets of simanim, and it's also between two people, between a husband and wife, a divorce. We'll just go over that in a minute. But the point of this portion of the Gemara is to decipher and understand, when you look at simanim, what siman may take precedent over another siman, because that's a logical question. If two people come with simanim, how do we know who's right? So the Gemara, sometimes cryptically and sometimes clearly, tries to establish what simonim hold precedence over another. So we started this last week. So let me just start. I know we did this, but from the last of the smaller lines, and then we'll go into the wide lines. So remember, I think it was David or someone asked the question, what happens if you have eight echad, not two eidim, but one witness? So simonim v'simonim ve'ed echad. If one person brought simonim and another person brought simonim and a witness, so now you have the scales tilted slightly in favor of the person who brought the one witness. Says the Gemara, eid echad kaman de lesse done. And you have to leave it until Mashiach comes, meaning that unless you have two witnesses, al pi shnayim eidim yakim davar, one witness doesn't do anything. So if two people clash and each one brings a fairly legitimate siman, one with a witness, one without, you have to hold it until Mashiach comes because there is no clear evidence. One witness doesn't do it. Then we also said, Edi Ariga Veda Nefila, if it had to do with a garment, and one person brought witnesses that he owned it because it was knitted or sewn or whatever for him, and the other says, no, I have Edim that it fell from me. So Nosson Edi Nefila. We give it to Nefila. Why? I mean, the other guy brings witnesses. He says it's mine. And we say that, yes, sure, it was yours. You had it knit. You had it specifically tailored for you. But that was then. You sold it. And now it fell from somebody else. So in other words, we go by the later of falling. So if he can show that it fell from him, again, the Gemara is contrasting for us different scenarios and how you look at simanim. Then we got into the next section, midas arko, midas rachbo. If one person described, let's say it was an object, and one person described the length of the object, it was 2.5 feet, and someone described the width of the object, it was, let's say, 1 3/4. So also the midas arko, we give it to the midas arko. Now here, actually, Rashi says we're dealing with a talus, where a person had a talus, and the talus, I don't know, 4 feet, let's say, in length and 2.5 feet in width, as an example. The midas rachbo shura kermishayla kidei machselo umar b'koi. Because when a person opens a talus, when you do the mitzvah of a tifas talus, and you open the talus and you spread it wide, then if a person is looking, according to the Gemara, he can estimate how wide it is. That's a chush that I don't have necessarily. But when you look at it, you can say, oh, it's 2.5 feet wide, roughly. So in other words, so the Gemara is saying that a person can estimate the width, umidas arko lo mishtarlo, but a person can't necessarily estimate the length. So if a person says it's 4 feet, and the other person says it's 2.5, and you're close on both, says the Gemara, you give it to the one with the length because it must be his because he knows the length, because you can't estimate the length. Now again, the Gemara is not clear. And we'll look at Rashi here, why the length has more cheshivas, so to speak, than the width. But the Gemara is saying that one can estimate the width, so don't count on the fact that he is really the owner or the one who is in control. Says Rashi, midas arko, ze oma midas arko, v'ze noisen midas rachbo. Says Rashi, Shiurim Mishaylo, Imro, Oisa, Biyad Habalim, Shiura Kishihabala, Mechusaba, Imtalisu. So think if it's a talis and you open it up and spread it, then someone can do a quick observation. And again, if you're capable of doing that, and you can quickly say, oh, it's about 2.5 feet. Again, the Gemara gives no further explanation, and there's no mafarshim that really delve into it. So we'll have to take it at face value that Arko has a greater significance than Rachba.
Excuse me, Rabbi, when we open a talus, we open it the length side, but there's more stuff hanging down. So we can't tell.
But he says, but Jay, when he says length and width, he means length top to bottom and width left to right. So when you open the talus and you're about to wrap yourself, you're right. It could well be that the rachba is the longer side of the talus because that's the left to right, right? What you're going to wrap yourself with. And that, according to this Gemara, is easier to estimate, according to this Gemara, than Orko.
I would think the other way around. When you open it up, you know that the vertical, the shorter side, you see because it doesn't reach the ground.
Right.
And so whatever side you're calling that, I would have called it the shorter side or the width, and the longer side, the length.
Right. When you're putting together a package for UPS or FedEx or whatever, and they want you to measure, by definition, the length is whatever the longest side is.
Okay, so again, this Gemara doesn't give us more definition other than to say that Orko is more chashuv than Rachbo. So you're right, Menashe. I mean, however you define it, and we're not going to attempt to do that right now, but however you define it, the longer side is the side that carries the day. In other words, as between the two, we say that it's easier to estimate whatever the shorter side is than the longer side. Let's leave it. That's a better way to describe it. I don't want to say Rachbo, Orko. Jay, you may be right. Maybe it's top to bottom, left to right. But for some reason, that's the chashivas. Now, let's look at the very next one. Midas Arko, Midas Rachbo, Umidas Gamav. Let's say a person says, you know what? It's mine. Why? Because the talus, let's make it up, is 4 by 2.5. The other fellow says, I can't do the math very quick. Maybe someone can. What is 4 by 2.5 is, what's the square foot? What's the square feet of 4 by 2.5? What is it? 10.5 or roughly, let's say 10.5. So one person says, you know what? The talus is 4.5 by 2 feet. And the other one says, no, it's 22 square feet. Gamav meaning the multiple of the length and the width. So who knows more? And for the Gemara, Yanasa Lamidas Arko Varachbo. You give it to the person who knows the specific dimensions as opposed to the multiplication of the dimensions. Again, so let's look at Rashi. I mean, what's the seichel? Says Rashi, Midas Arko Varachbo Midas Gamav. Zeh Omar Kach Arko V'Kach Rachbo. One says it's 4 by 2, let's say. The combination of the width and the length is so and so, amas, bein hakol, total. He doesn't know the specific. He just knows, I know this talus is 10.5 square feet. How do you know it? I know it. How long is it? How short is it? I have no idea, but I know it's so. Says the Gemara, if someone has the particular knowledge of width and length, and the other has even a specific knowledge of total square feet, you go, well, what's the point here? The Gemara is trying to let us understand that when people clash and each one brings a siman, it's easy to say that's an easy one. Hold it until Eliyahu Navi comes, and then okay. Well, we know that the Gemara brings us Keku very often, or not very, but often. But how do you get to the bottom of it? So the Gemara is trying to help us understand and sharpen our thinking that there may be subtle differences between width times length versus width and length, but it shows a higher degree of knowledge, and that's the difference maker between the two. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, I mean, so example, let's forget these halves. That's too confusing. Simple example is one person says it's 12 square feet. Another one says that it's 3 feet by 4 feet. The 3 by 4 is much better because 12 could also be 6 by 2.
Right. So in other words, you're more specific in your knowledge. The more specific you are, that's the point here. The more specific you can be, the greater is the chance that it's yours. Now look at the next one. Midas arko, midas rachbo. One guy says, "Oh, I know it's 4 by 2." Midas mishkalov. The other one says, "Yeah, but I know it weighs 3.5 pounds." Okay, so think about that. One is very specific in width and length, and one is specific in weight. You know, midas mishkalov. You give it to the person who knows the weight, because that's harder to discern. It might be easier to discern, oh yeah, it's a 4 by 2, but 3.5 pounds? How would you know that? Teretz is, it's probably yours, and you probably weighed it, or at least you have, you held it in your hand. So if you held it in your hand, that means you are the one who found it, and you felt in your hand. Some people have a chush in their hands; they can figure out this is 3 pounds, 4 pounds, whatever. Again, all towards the point of how do we discern who gets it. Then the Gemara goes further. Now we're going into something that's even more complicated, which is Issa v'heter. Who omes simone get? The omes simone get. Okay, a man is about to give a get to his wife, and it's lost. Who do you give it to? You give it to the man. There's no get. You give it to the woman. She's divorced. Now we're talking about Issa v'heter. How do we accomplish that? How do we allow the potential of an Eishes Ish on this question of Simonim? That's a much more complicated question than whether or not I found the talus and the talus is, whatever. So says the Gemara, if each brings a simon, Yonasan law, you give it to her, says Rashi, I decided not to give the get, says the husband. It fell from me, and I'm divorced, and I can remarry. Now we're talking about much more powerful things. Says the Gemara, Yonasan law, Shehu Nosna v'Yodea Simonim, Aval Hi Imlo Nosna law Mehechin Yada. Says the Gemara, you know what? He will definitely know Simonim because he wrote the get, or he had the get written. So from him, there's no chachma. Of course, he knows what the get is. He handled it. But if she knows Simonim, how would she know Simonim? How would she possibly know Simonim get unless he handed it to her and she lost it? So you see the Gemara's thinking here. If they both brought Simonim, which could be legitimate, sure, he had the get, but he had to have given it to her for her to give Simone get. So this is a seichel question. What's logical here? Says the Gemara, b'mai, what are we talking about? Lema, if you're going to say b'minas archba rachma, that the measure, the simonim of the get were length and width, meaning, remember, gittin are written on parchment, so they're written as a scroll, so to speak. So there you can have a scroll of, let's say, I don't know, 2 feet by 1 foot or something like that. Dilma bahari denoket lechazia. So how can you give it to her? She observed it. She observed it as he was sort of presenting it or preparing it, and she estimated, yeah, it was 2 by 1. So why is that a raya, says the Gemara, that she's right and the simonim go after her? She could have seen the get before she got it, but she never got it. So he decided not to give it to her, but she saw what it looked like, and that's the simon she's giving. So that doesn't work. Says the Gemara, Elanochav Yeshboa Bitsad Ois Ploni. No. She's not giving you length and width. She's saying, you know what? There was a pinprick in the get by the letter, let's just say, Gerashti. In other words, one of the key words, she noticed a pinprick. How would she know that if she didn't have it in her hands? So again, the Gemara is telling us let's just get to the bottom of it. Let's understand whose taina is greater and why. So if it's a length and a width question, in issues we have to be a little bit more circumspect and say we can't do it. But if you're talking about a pinprick, then she would definitely know that. Then we give it to her. Now, another example. Who omer simone achut v'hi omeret simone achut. The get was tied up in a bow. In other words, there was a string or something that held it together, and he is describing the chut, the thread. V'hi omeret simone chut. Says the Gemara, you give it to her. Why? Again, who is more likely to be the person who held it last in this case? The husband who says, no, I lost it and there's no get, or the wife who said, or the ex-wife who says, no, you gave it to me and I lost it. Ilema Bechuria Sumka, we had this Gemara, this language before. If she's going to describe it by color, that it was red or white or blue or green, whatever, what do you mean? She saw the chut, she saw the thread as he was about to give it to her. It was a red a thread that was holding the get together. And she says, it's red. How could you believe her then? Of course it's red. She saw it. And he never gave it. So that can't be the reason. Ella b'midos arka. Says the Gemara back. And then it's interesting because now we're doubling back. And we're saying, no, that won't work. But it has to be the length of the thread. So now we're being more specific. If it was wrapped in a thread or a ribbon, whatever, that was a foot long, and she says, it was a foot long, how would she know it was a foot long? She must have unwrapped the get and seen the ribbon and said, oh, this is a ribbon that's a foot long. Now that's already a siman. Again, so the Gemara says, even by ishus, which is a matter of Isser and Heter, which is very powerful, there is a siman that can come down here, and we would give it to her, not to him. Now, the last case, right before the Mishnah, who omer bechafisa v'hi omer bechafisa. If he says, it was in my bag. I had a bag, and the bag had the get in it. V'hi omer bechafisa, and she says it was in a bag and describes it. Now here says the Gemara, Yunasan lo. You don't give it to her, you give it to him. My tama, made the yada, the kolma, the isle bechafisa, hudamaniachle. At least initially, we say that a man has his little case and he keeps all his important documents in his case. Okay, that was, in other words, that's the way, I guess, what we call a man purse or something where a person maybe was a leather case or something. So if you find it in the chafisa, then the likelihood is that it's his and he didn't give it to her, as opposed to her and it's in the chafisa, because he's not giving her the chafisa, he's just giving her the get. So if you find it in the chafisa, says Rashi, motzes oso, you find it in the chafisa, then the likelihood is greater that it's his than hers. Again, these are all interesting examples of what the Gemara is trying to tell us, that you have to do a balancing test. And even by Isser and Heter, which has greater ramifications, we can come to a conclusion and say it was his or hers based on how we weigh the simanim. So, of course, this is something that we don't take lightly, because, if it's just a question of I dropped it, you dropped it, okay, so you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world, but it's the end of the world on a spiritual side, of course, if we said that we're going to give her a get that she really didn't get. So that's how the Gemara concludes, to give us some understanding of simanim and what we do with simanim. Okay, so now we've concluded this section, and we're going to turn now to another interesting topic, and I'm sure we've all been thinking about this all along. And that is the question of, from a time standpoint, if you find something that you have to announce, how long do you have to announce it for? I mean, what's the time frame? How long do you have to handle it? How long do you have to hold it before you can say, you know what, no one's coming for this? So that's an important question. So now the Mishnah is going to tell us about how long is it that you have to wait to announce it? In other words, how long before you can say no one's coming for this and therefore I am keeping it? So there's a discussion in Machlokes in the among Tanaim with Rabbi Yehuda, Tanakama. So the Tanakama says ad kedei sheyedu bo shchenav. And these are words that the Mishnah, the Rashi says, we're going to wait for the Gemara to describe because he's not going to talk about it here. But what it means is essentially until the Shchenav, this is the key word, Shchenav, until the Shchenav, the neighbors know about it. But that doesn't really give us an explanation yet. But that's Rav Meir's position. In other words, once the neighbors know about it, then you can say no one's showing up, I'm keeping it. Okay, so let's hold that thought because the Gemara is going to explain what that means. Divrei Rav Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, okay, shalosh regalim v'achar regel ha'achron shiva yamin. You know what? You've got to hold it a full year. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, a full year, and then a week. In other words, so you're obligated for what seems like quite a bit of time. Why? What's the point, says Rabbi Yehuda? In other words, Shalosh Regalim is what you have to hold. In other words, you have to give an opportunity for someone to say, again, why? Because you remember we had a discussion, where would a person rather be? In other words, under what circumstance would a person be more trustworthy or likely to say, I'll get it back? If it's in a small crowd or a big crowd? Remember we had this discussion in the Gemara, and the Gemara said, in a big crowd. In a big crowd, then it's likely that since people, we're talking about in Eretz Yisrael, and people come up, we're not talking about he dropped a handkerchief. We're talking maybe something much more chashuv. It's worth a lot of money. And when a person comes to Yerushalayim, Oila Regel, as it were, then there would be a place where people would call out lost objects. So they probably, if any of you have ever been to, I sort of equate this in my own mind. If you've been to London, there is a very interesting place called Speaker's Corner, where people gather. It's a gathering place. I'm sure it's famous, but I'm sure in other places too. And there you're seen and you're not seen. You can get up, you can talk, you get up. So this is kind of like a speaker's corner for lost objects. In other words, everybody knows that when it comes to Pesach Shavuos Sukkot in Yerushalayim, you go to such and such a place and you hear people calling out, who lost this? I found this. Again, you're giving them some information, but not enough for them to be able to take it unless they have the simon. So you have this speaker's corner of people who are constantly announcing, and that's what you do when you're Oila L'Regel. Now, of course, it must be a lot of stuff that's lost in Yerushalayim on Regalim. So you probably have a very long list of things. So says Rabbi Yehuda, you go 3 Regalim. He missed it the first time, okay, he gets a second crack. He missed it the second time, he gets a third crack. But once you finish the third regel, so what? It's over? He says, no, it's not over. Now, if he heard it in the third crack, then this is important. He can go to his house. So the inference is that 3 days is the furthest a person would go to be Ola Regel to Yerushalayim. 3 days to go home, the Yachzer Shlosha, and 3 days to come back to Yerushalayim, the Yachzer Yom Echad, and 1 day to search out and find the person who found it and to claim it. So what's the Mishnah telling us? What's the Yehuda telling us? That in the circumstance of someone who is Shalas Aveda, you have to go out of your way to make sure that a person will have every opportunity to find to say, this is my object. And then even when he leaves and he goes back and then he thinks about it and he's heading to Tzfat or he's heading to Tveria or wherever it is. And he says, wait a minute, I think that's mine. And he says, I'm going to double back and I'm going to head back. So if 3 days is the furthest distance from Yerushalayim that a person travels Ola Regel, then he needs those 3 days to get back. So it's 3 plus 3, and we give him 1 extra day to find it. So that's Rabbi Yehuda's theory. Says the Mishnah, Kedei sheyelech kol echad lebeso shlosha, mishayishma hachroza. When he hears the announcement, v'yada im ovid lo klum, im yavin she'ovid yachsha shlosha. So maybe he doesn't absorb it right away, but he figures out, when he gets back, he says, oh, they announced that there was such and such a jewel or something. Oh, mine must be in my drawer. Comes home, it's not in his drawer. It's not in his drawer. So he says, wait a minute, that's my jewel. I got to quickly go back to Yerushalayim and give him the samanim to get my jewel back. So he runs back, takes him 3 days at max. The Yachris Yom Echad, and he says, Ani avadati. He says, I lost it, and here's the simon. The Gemara Parach, the Begimel Yomim and Shos Lachzal Eretz Yisrael. Rashi gives us a hint. 3 days isn't enough. You can't get to Sof Eretz Yisrael in 3 days. Okay, that's an aside question which we'll deal with. In other words, Rashi is saying that the furthest distance to Yerushalayim is more than 3 days. But be that as it may, for now, that's Rabbi Yehuda's thinking. Rabbi Yehuda says a person isn't sure when he hears Pesach and Shavuos, he didn't know about it. Sukkot, all of a sudden he hears about this item, and he says, I don't know if it's mine. So he goes home, he's an honest guy, and he realizes it's his. So I have to quickly get back to Yerushalayim to announce myself, and that's why he gets the extra week. So that's the machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Gemara is going to give us a little bit more definition on both of these sides, so the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. But anyway, the important thing is that you see that the whole idea of getting it back isn't as simple as it seems. In other words, if a person loses, it's not like someone lost something at the corner of Arcola and Lamberton, which the Gemara will kind of allude to in a little bit later. In other words, the friendly corner, that's one thing. Here we're talking about probably something much bigger, and we're talking about a Hamon Am of thousands of people, and a person loses something of substance, says again, this is the key. The key is Hashavas Aveda is such an important mitzvah that we have to give both the finder and the Balaveda, the one who lost it, the greatest opportunity, in other words, to fulfill this mitzvah. So that's what we're talking about. Go ahead, Jay.
I'm just surprised, or I don't understand why in Yerushalayim they didn't create a lost and found department in a building where everything gets brought in that is found, and everything, and each person who lost something can come and identify it. For the small cost that it would take to put that together and to man it, it would solve all of these problems where the individual doesn't know what to do. He has to wait a whole year. Let the Bezdin have a separate little building or an office or whatever, and they hold it for a year and you don't have to worry about it. Why didn't they create something?
Jay, you're too logical.
It's simple. It's not.
You're too logical.
They had so many procedures for the Beis Hamikdash and other things.
Right.
This would have been a trivial procedure,
right,
compared to running the Beis Hamikdash.
You know what? That's too logical for them to have thought of. It's a good question. You're right that it could have been made much simpler without having to worry about. But here's the point. I think that if you just put it in a lost and found and don't make announcements, you don't catch people's attention. In other words, let's just assume for the moment, we have to make this assumption, that everyone is Oila Rego. What happens if the fellow who lost it, the poor fellow who lost it, isn't Oila Rego? He's sick. In fact, the Mefarshim say, why you do it for 3 regalim is because maybe he was sick on 2 of them. So we're going to make an assumption that he was sick Pesach, he was sick Shavuos, but not Sukkot. Again, it's not completely logical.
They could have had lists mounted, simple stuff would have basically avoided any abuse. And
No, it's a good point. It's a very good
somebody
point.
buying.
It's a good point. If anybody has a thought here, weigh in, but it's a good
Well,
point.
Rabbi, this
Rabbi?
is Yale. I was going to say, we're talking about the Ola Regel, and a lot of things get lost, and it makes sense. It would make sense to have a lost and found, but we still need all the detailed rules because not everything is lost going to and from Yerushalayim. In other words, we still need to know what are the rules. If you find something, you find a lost object, what do you need to do?
So
it's
what
not
you're
like
saying is that
everything.
we can extrapolate from this Gemara what you do if it isn't Yerushalayim, as an example.
Right.
That's a very interesting point.
Right. You need the rules. You need the rules to apply to all the other lost objects that are found, not because somebody was traveling to and from Yerushalayim. Somebody's traveling along the road and something gets lost and somebody finds it and picks it up.
I mean, I agree with that, but you
Then the question, Yale, is where do you announce it? Let's say you're 100% right. Let's say it didn't happen in Yerushalayim. It happened on the road. So then what do? You go up to Yerushalayim and announce it in Yerushalayim anyway, because people are going there and they'll say, oh, I remember going up to Yerushalayim and all of a sudden I didn't find my my jewel. I didn't see it.
That's a good question. If it wasn't lost on the way to Yerushalayim, is there any benefit to announcing it at
Right.
Yerushalayim?
So that's the question we're grappling with. And Jay, you make a good point. And Yale, you're correct. So in other words, this is a broader lesson than just Euler Regel Yerushalayim. I'll agree with you. So you can't just simply say we're dealing with Yerushalayim, but Yerushalayim is an example of what the achrayus is, the responsibility is on a finder to make an announcement that will be widespread and that people will say, oh, wait a minute, yes, and then give some money. So these are all very good questions because we don't have enough context to understand. Certainly Chazal was very smart. And Jay, to your point, it makes all the sense in the world to have a lost and found in the next to the Sanhedrin or in some place where everybody can come.
Rabbi?
That would have been a model for smaller towns as well.
That's right.
Absolutely. What Yale is saying. It just puts a system in place that should make it easier for anywhere and
anyone. Right.
Rabbi?
Yeah. Go ahead, Louis.
In the past couple of years, they've been excavating the main road from Ir David up to the Temple Mount.
Right.
And one of the things that has been located is a large platform, which seems to have no other use. They speculate that this may be such a place where people would come to announce lost objects and to look for lost objects.
Very interesting.
So it may be that, in fact, what Jay is talking about is there or was there.
Yeah. That's very interesting. In other words, there was such a place, and but here's the point. The point, I guess, Jay, to your point, and incorporate what Louis just said, is you can have a big room with lost and found, but if someone isn't announcing, or there isn't a gabbai who is saying, okay, like at an auction, Article 39, we found a so-and-so. Anybody claiming? Come and give some money. It may have been that. In other words, there were so many thousands or hundreds of items that everything was marked. And wait a minute, we're going to see in the Gemara in a minute, whether we get to it now or not, is there's a machlokes on what you say. Do you say there was a lost object and you have to say, oh, wait a minute, I lost a jewel? Or do you say, there was a jewel that was lost, give some money? In other words, do you broaden the discussion and say, so we found an object here. Did you lose an object? Without even saying what it is. And someone said, I lost a very valuable watch. I lost a very valuable ring. I lost a very valuable brooch. Wait a minute. So in other words, you're not even telling me what was lost, but I'm requiring you to tell me what you lost. Or, says the Gemara later, do we say, we found a ring. Everybody who lost the ring, line up here. In other words, you're being specific without giving the simon. So that's a machlokes in the Gemara. We're going to see that in a little bit. So Jay, maybe it was more organized than we think. I mean, for all I know, this was a system that really was advanced, but because there were thousands of people who came, and you're right in saying that maybe what Yale is saying is that that's a model for every community in Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about Yerushalayim because thousands of people come, but when you come to Tzafat, it may be 100 people, or when you come to Akko, which the question of whether it was Eretz Yisrael or not, maybe it was only 15 people. In other words, so you can take this model and put it wherever you want. Yerushalayim is the biggest example because that's where most of the people come, especially Oil Regel. But in point of fact, it works everywhere. So I think everything we're saying here is kind of, we're saying similar things. And what the Gemara is about to tell us here is how we look at it. So let's get into this Gemara because it's fascinating. Let's start.
The reason I brought this up is because to wait for a whole year is a much more complicated thing than just announcing it locally
Absolutely.
in a small village.
No, you're right. But when you're talking about thousands of people, then the Gemara is telling us we have to broaden this as much as possible because the mitzvah of Hashavas Aved is that great. Again, this is a reflection on the mitzvah. If it wasn't such an important mitzvah, why make such a big deal? Okay, you lost it, found it, whatever. No, the mitzvah of Shavas Aveda, and again, we've had this again and again and again in the Gemara, so we know this, that a person's chashivas, you have to hold my goods in the greatest chashivas as if it was yours, and I have to do that for you. So a person has to look out for his friend, and if someone lost it, you can't just, big deal, he lost it, it's not such an important thing. It is an important thing. And therefore, we treat it with the greatest of concern. And we say that if a person lost it, we should give him every opportunity to find it. And again, we can have this discussion all day long. Do you wait a year? Do you wait 6 months? How you do it, where you do it. But the underlying is that there is a system. And we'll see again now what Rabbi Meir is telling us in his system and Rabbi Yehuda is telling us in his system. So in the Rashi is just telling us especially for Rabbi Yehuda, it's a more complicated system, and you need 3 regalim plus a week. Now let's go into the Gemara here, because from Rabbi Meir it was very cryptic, and Rashi said, "Wait, we'll talk about it." So what does it mean when Rabbi Meir says, in other words, when he says, when his neighbors know about it. So what does that mean? Says the Gemara, Tana, we learn, Shchene Aveda. The Shchenim, the neighbors of the Aveda. In other words, the Shchenim of the lost object. In fact, the Gemara, Ma Shchene Aveda. What does it mean, the neighbors of the lost object? Ile Shchenim, the Baal Aveda. If you're talking about the neighbors of the person who lost the item, you can't tell me, okay, let's just say, Jay, you're the guy who lost it. And Reb Meir says that your shchenim, where you live, on Lamberton or wherever you live, those are the shchenim that need to know about the lost object. And then you've qualified. Wait a minute. But if we know it's the shchenim of you, give it back to you, Jay. What do you mean shchenim? If we're pinpointing the shchenim of the Baal Aveda, then we know the Baal Aveda. That can't be. It can't be that we know who lost it and we're talking about the neighbors of the person who lost it, because then we know who it is. Ella, says the Gemara, shchena mokam chenimtzas b'Aveda. It's the shchenim of the place you found it. I found this object at the corner of, let's just say, Lamberton and South Belgrade. So what am I going to do? I'm not going to go to Kemp Mill Road and announce it there because that's too far away. So the shchenim Who are the Shchenim? The people around Lamberton and South Belgrade. That, says Reb Meir, is where you announce it. In other words, so you announce it, and you at the corner of, or you can do it in shul, whatever, but you announce it and say anybody lost an item at the corner of Lamberton and South Belgrade, please come and identify it. And then again, Reb Meir doesn't tell us exactly how long, but let's just a reasonable amount of time, a week, do whatever. It clearly doesn't necessarily, he's arguing on Rabbi Yehuda, so he doesn't mean Shalosh Regalim, but at Mosai. So the answer is, once all the neighbors, let's say there are 20 houses, more or less, around that South Belgrade area. So when all 20 owners have heard that there is an Aveda that was lost, then you've accomplished, then you've fulfilled your requirement to make an announcement, and no one shows up, you keep it. Someone shows up, because we're saying, and again, we can argue this back and forth, the likelihood is that it was lost by someone who was in that neighborhood. Now, it could have been a passerby who lives in Potomac, but the fact of the matter is, we're not going to go there. We're going to say that l'chaira, it was someone who lived in the area, and we're going to make an announcement for the area to alert everybody that at the corner of South Belgrade and Lamberton, there's a lost item. Then we're going to see what happens. So that's Reb Meir. Reb Meir is very narrow. Reb Meir doesn't. Says Rashi, Shcheinei Makom Shemitzvah Aveda Shema Shalahenhi. So what does Reb Meir care about? He only cares about the people who live there. He doesn't worry about the whole Olam. He says the people who live there more than likely are the ones who lost it. That's his view. Yeah. So if you announce it so that everybody who lives there, more or less, knows, you fulfilled your obligation. That's Reb Meir.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yeah.
Does it get more complicated when the object that's found is like a bicycle? A bicycle that's found today in our neighborhood doesn't mean it came from right around the place it's found.
Correct.
Somebody could have ridden it from another area or another neighborhood even. So it should depend on the object itself, whether or not it is the kind of thing that doesn't move very far or it's motaltalin almost.
So the Gemara is telling us that Reb Meir has no concern for that.
He has no concern.
No concern for that. He is saying that what's local is local, and this is local. If you find an object locally, your obligation is to announce it locally and not, you're right, not worry about someone who was a passerby. It could very well have been. But in Cain, ain ledover sof. There's a famous expression. You know, you gotta cut it off. You can't say, I'm going to worry about the whole world when I'm dealing with a matter that I'm not going to say 100%, maybe 80%, maybe 75% is likely to be local. But that's what Meir's point is, you've got to localize it as much as possible. So when I say Shcheinei Aveda, I mean the neighborhood of where it was lost. If in the neighborhood where it was lost, you've made an announcement, you're a tzaddik, you're good. Shabbos Aveda. Someone comes to the fore, great. Someone doesn't come to the fore, sorry. So that's Reb Meir. So let's just get into Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda is much more complicated. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Sholosh regalim in a week. Frek the Gemara. Remember what Rashi said at the end of the last Rashi. Rashi says that Uba Gemara Paruch, the Gemara is going to ask that 3 days isn't enough to get to the end of Eretz Yisrael. Now, today you can get to the end of Yisrael. You get to the end of Eretz Yisrael how quickly? Even if you drive, what is it, an hour and a half, 2? I don't know. I mean, it's not very far to drive the length, let alone the width. But the length of Eretz Yisrael back in the day, of course, you had camels, not cars. But the point being, it's not very long. Says Rashi, the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's not enough time. Now let's look at the Gemara. Baraminu, I'm going to ask you a question from a brisa. B'shlosha b'mar cheshvan Shol and Asagir Shamim. There is a machlokes in the Gemara in Tainus when we start saying Masha Baruch Amrita Geshem. In other words, when is the rainy season in Eretz Yisrael start? So there's a machlokes between I think it's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Gamliel. On the third day of Mar Cheshvan, you pray for rain. Now, when is the end of Sukkot? The 22nd of Tishrei, right? 22nd of Tishrei Shmini Atzeres. So how many days are left in Tishrei? 8. There's 8 days left in Tishrei. And he says, B'shlosha b'Mar Cheshvan, 3 days into Mar Cheshvan. How many days is that? 11. So now you got 11 days that you have before the rainy season. We'll see in a minute why it's relevant. Of Gabriel Omer, no, B'Zayin Bo. You know, it's not the Thursday of Mar Cheshvan, it's the 7th day. How many days is that? 15. Shehu Tesvav Yom. Okay, stop. What are we saying here? The Gemara wants to tell us that we don't want to announce the rainy season, because as soon as we announce it, we hope the Rebbeinu Shalom gives us, who knows, Geshem Me'itam, tremendous amount of rain. Do we want anybody to be traveling when that rainy season starts? No. We want everybody to be safely home. The rainy season starts, and then everybody is now in his place. So that's the assumption. So if you're going to assume that everybody needs to be home for the rainy season, and Rav Gamliel is telling me that it's in the 7th day of Mar Cheshvan, which means that's 15 days after people leave Yerushalayim to go home. And according to this Gemara, the outer boundary of Eretz Yisrael is where? Nahar Paras. Okay, for the geography buffs, where is Nahar Paras? Nahar Paras is what we know today as Iraq. Iraq is where Nahar Paras is. So if the Euphrates River. So if you're going to go as far as Nahar Paras, and it takes you 15 days to get there, how can you tell me in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, that it's Shalosh Regalim and a week? What do you mean a week? 3 days one way, 3 days another way? Forget about it. The furthest part from Eretz Yisrael is 15 days according to Rabbi Gamliel, or 11 according to, let's say, the other Mandavrin. It's certainly not 3. So that's what Rashi means when they ask the kasha, and that's the kasha here. How can you tell me, Rabbi Yehuda, that the announcement has to be because people will get to the furthest part of Eretz Yisrael where they go after Oil Regel? That's not the case. People come as far as Nahar Paras to be Oil Regel. So it's a practical matter. This is a practical question. How can you say in the Mishnah a week, 3 plus 1, when that's not Shaykh? Okay, that's the kasha. So let's take a look. Rashi tells us. Kadeshi Yagia below Yidbeku Hagashamim Alma Kulahai Beinan Misnisim Tanish Shlosha. We don't want anyone to get stuck on the way, Chas v'Shalom, and be flooded like we had in Kentucky or in Tennessee or in Arkansas, where people mamish couldn't move because the rain's flooded. I mean, we want a bracha. Rain is a siman bracha, but we don't want people to get stuck in the rain and all of a sudden the siman bracha will not be a siman bracha. We want everybody to be at home. It starts raining, and then you till to your land and take advantage. So that's the kasha. That's the simple kasha on Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll just touch on an answer, and Mitzvah Shem will go right. But again, it's conceptual here. We have to think about this all in the context of how do you return it? When do you announce it? According to Meir, it's fairly simple. Tanakama says a Shiur b'Shcheinav until the Shchenim of the place of the Aveda are notified, and once they're notified, the clock is ticking. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's 3 regalim and a week. Amar Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef comes and gives an answer to this kasha, and he says, no, lo kasha, not a problem. Kan b'mikdash rishon, kan b'mikdash sheni. we're talking about two different times in history. The Mishnah is talking about one thing, and Mishnah, the Brisa the Mishnah in Tainus is talking about something else. What does he mean? So let's just start with this because this gets into much more detail. The Mikdash Rishon, in the time of the first Beis Hamikdash in Nefishi Yisrael Tuva, that there was a multitude of Jews. Tiksiv Bahu Yehuda Yisrael Rabin Kachol Asher Ala Yam Larov. There were so many Jews that it was like the sands of the ocean. So there were so many Yidden. Be'in and Kulihai, we need as much time as we can because there was comings and goings and goings and comings. And until everybody got home, we need 15 days. Okay, we need it. That's that Mishnah over there. Mikdash Sheni, on the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, in the Nefishi Yisrael Tuva, there weren't as many Jews. Tiksiv Bahu Kol Hakol Ke'echad Arba Riba Alpayim Shlosha Me'as V'Shishim. The entire totality of the Jewish population, I think, was 342,360.
42,000.
42,000, sorry, 42,360, which is a tipa shebiyam. It's a drop in the bucket. Then you don't need so much time because how long does it take 42,000 people to come and to go? Then it's 3 days. So Rabbi Yosef wants to make a distinction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah in Tainus. And he says that no, that's why one is so long and one is so short.
They
So
took into account the traffic.
exactly right, accounting for
The road's
traffic.
not that necessarily that wide for so many people.
No, you're accounting for traffic. That's the point. In other words, it's so hard to come in and come out. Remember what Chazal tell us. Chazal tell us that Shishimei Ariba, 600,000 Jews could fit at the Makam HaMikdash. How is that possible? We know what the Makam HaMikdash looks like today. Everybody has Dalan Amas. How could you and I and 600,000 people have Dalan Amas? It was a gewaldige mess. But you get the point. The point is that it depends on the number of people as to how much time you reserve.
Yeah.
So that's the answer Rabbi Yosef gives. And just to conclude for today, Amalei Abaya, but Abaya says, Vayeshva Kohenim v'Halavim v'Mashurim v'Ashurim v'Chol Yisrael ba'Oreim, that by the second Beis Hamikdash, all the Kahanim, Leviim, the singers, the gatekeepers, they all went back to their respective homes. You're telling me that in the Makam HaMikdash, in the first Beis Hamikdash, there were so many people and it was so far. But wait a minute, just because there was 42,000 people doesn't mean that the furthest person still didn't live on the borders of the Har Paras. So you're telling me that it has to do with the multitudes, and I'm telling you, fine, you have far less people, but you still have a long way to travel. So he wants to slug up Rabbi Yosef and says, your distinction between Mikdash Rishon and Mikdash Sheni is not a valid distinction because even the people in the Mikdash Sheni needed that time. So the Gemara says, Ipcha Mistabra. If that's the case, let's flip it. Mikdash Rishon and Nefishi Yisrael Tuva, the mitzvahs Alma, Mishtach Shiur, the Ozla Ben B'Yama Ben B'Layla. Lo be'inin kolehai. No. By our Mishnah, sure there were many more people, but because there was so much more activity, they worked day and night. The caravans went day, the caravans went night. So 3 days is enough because no one is waiting online for the next caravan. It's like, we've seen these, one bus leaves, next one comes in. One bus leaves, next one comes in. So they were going day and night. There was never a pause. Therefore, in the Makam HaMikdash Rishon, 3 days was enough because the activity was thing. Okay. Mikdash Sheni D'Lo Nefishi Yisrael Tuva Lo Mitzvahs Alma V'Lo Mishtach Shiur the Ozla Ben B'Yom Ben B'Layla Be'inen Kulihai. But in Mikdash Sheni, where there was only 42,000 people, if you miss the bus, you miss the bus. You don't get another bus until the next day. So what are you going to do? You're going to sit and wait. That's why it took so long. So in other words, this is a semantical argument that Rabbi Yosef wanted to tell us the chilik between our Mishnah and the Mishnah in Tainus was one approach, and Abaya says no, it wasn't, because the pasuk tells us that there was not a whole lot of difference. In other words, he flips it around. Suffice it to say, whether you hold that the Mikdash Rishon was 15 or 3, or Mikdash Sheni was Rishon with 3, the Gemara is giving us a chilik and answering the question why our Mishnah says what it does, a week, and why that Gemara in Tainus says what it does 15 days. So we're going to stop here. But again, think about all of this is that in yesteryear, I mean, it was a whole different setup. So today you would say, what's the big deal? You know, it takes me an hour to fly from north to south. It takes me a few hours to drive the north to south, and I shouldn't have a problem. Teretz is, yes, you're right. So therefore, maybe today, if we applied this principle, then we would say, okay, chalapachas maybe a week, but you don't need as much time. But in those days, you needed much time. But what I find interesting is that according to this daya, the furthest reaches of Eretz Yisrael was Nahar Paras. So when you think about the geography of Eretz Yisrael, it's very interesting because the Gemara tells us, and the Torah tells us, but the Gemara also elaborates on the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and Nahar Paras is what I always thought was outside of Eretz Yisrael. But according to this Rashi, that's not the case. So again, we can maybe get into it a little bit further and maybe do a little geography hunting as to understand what were those borders and why Nahar Paras was used as the outer boundary of Eretz Yisrael, at least for something. I mean, for Geshamim or whatever. But anyway, that's the machlokes. And next week we'll get into it further. But you see, this whole question of how far you announce is not as simple as we think. Not as simple as we think. So
Sounds like the oil wells of Saudi Arabia were part of Greater Eretz Yisrael.
right, Alavai, right? Well, today,
That was a different direction. But anyway, there is a promise. There is a promise in Torah.
It's on the way to Baghdad. I think you have to cross Saudi Arabia to get to Baghdad.
No, you don't.
No?
I think Baghdad is on a parallel, if you will, right? It's further north.
I'll look it up, yeah.
I think of Saudi Arabia, I
You
think,
only need to cross Syria.
right, Syria, right, exactly right. So you're talking about north, northwest, northeast, whatever. Saudi Arabia is more like southeast. In other words,
Southeast, yeah.
route southeast. So you're talking about a different direction. But once you get into, and again, the Gemara many times talks about areas, Damascus, and the travels of the Bnei Yisrael in that direction. So maybe it's not that far-fetched that when you travel in that direction, you hit the border at Nahar Paras. In any event, it's a fascinating Gemara, and Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll pick it up and get into it in greater detail.